My name is Julia Martinez. I'm 34 years old. And the moment that shattered everything wasn't when I took down a sniper from 800 yards in Kandahar, or when I coordinated a hostage rescue that saved 13 American civilians. It was walking into a glass tower in Manhattan, wearing a pencil skirt and carrying a resume instead of a rifle, listening to a 20-something recruiter destroy me with corporate condescension. Military service? He flipped through my paperwork like it was contaminated, his voice dripping with the kind of superiority that comes from never having your life depend on split-second decisions. We're really looking for someone with office culture experience. Team synergy, not just someone who knows how to shoot a gun. The laughter that rippled through that conference room cut deeper than shrapnel. 3 other candidates exchanged smirks while the recruiter's assistant covered her mouth to hide her amusement. I sat there in my only interview suit, feeling smaller with every dismissive glance, carrying secrets about classified missions that would keep these corporate warriors awake for weeks. They saw my uniform history and assumed I didn't belong in their air-conditioned world. They had no idea what was about to walk through their front door. The conference room smelled like expensive coffee and ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Manhattan that probably cost more per square foot than most people made in a year, while polished marble floors reflected the kind of lighting that made everyone look successful whether they deserved it or not. I sat across from Derek Sullivan, 32, MBA from Wharton, the kind of recruiter who wore his corporate pedigree like a Purple Heart. His assistant, Madison, perched beside him with an iPad and the predatory smile of someone who'd perfected the art of professional dismissal. "So, Julia," Derek began, my resume spread before him like evidence in a trial where I was already guilty. "Let's talk about your unique background." Unique. The word hung in the air like cordite after gunfire. 8 years in the Army, I said, keeping my voice level despite the condescension dripping from his tone. Specialized in reconnaissance and tactical operations. Led teams in high-stress environments, coordinated complex missions, managed logistics under extreme conditions. Right, Derek nodded with the kind of patience adults reserve for children explaining their imaginary friends. But this is Meridian Capital. We're talking about financial analysis, client relations, strategic planning, not combat. The way he said combat made it sound like a disease I'd contracted overseas and brought back to contaminate his sterile corporate environment. Madison giggled, actually giggled behind her manicured hand. "I think what Derek means is, we need someone who understands office culture, team synergy, collaborative problem solving. While she'd been learning buzzwords in business school, I'd been solving problems that involved keeping people alive when everything went to hell around them. You do realize this is a desk job, right?" Derek continued, his voice taking on that particular tone of corporate superiority that men like him had perfected during years of explaining obvious things to people they considered beneath them. "We're not exactly storming the beaches of Normandy here." The laughter that followed felt like small arms, fire sharp, sudden, designed to wound. 3 other candidates sitting along the conference room wall exchanged looks that said, "Thank God that's not my life." One adjusted his tie to hide a smirk. Another whispered something to her neighbor that made them both snicker. I sat there in my only interview suit, navy blue from Target, tailored as well as I could afford, feeling my shoulders tense with the familiar weight of being underestimated by people who'd never been tested beyond quarterly performance reviews. The memory hit me like incoming artillery. Fallujah, 2019. Staff Sergeant Martinez bleeding out in a bombed outbuilding while insurgents closed in from 3 directions. I'd made the call to extract him through hostile territory, coordinating air support while laying down covering fire that kept 7 Marines alive long enough for medevac to arrive. "The thing about military experience," Derek was saying, warming to his theme while I struggled to stay present in his climate-controlled reality, "is that it's very rigid. Following orders, chain of command, that whole structure. But in today's business environment, we need creative thinkers, innovators, people who can think outside the box." Think outside the box. The phrase would have been funny if it didn't cut so deep. While he'd been thinking inside conference rooms, I'd been thinking my way out of ambushes, improvising solutions with equipment that was falling apart and backup that might never come. "I've had to innovate plenty," I said, my voice carrying an edge I immediately regretted. When your communications go down and you're surrounded by hostile forces, creativity isn't optional. Sure, Derek waved his hand dismissively, like he was brushing away smoke. But that's life or death stuff. This is business. It requires a different skill set entirely. A different skill set, right, because managing scared 19-year-old soldiers while artillery shells exploded overhead was somehow less demanding than managing spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. Madison leaned forward with the kind of concerned expression that suburban women perfect during book club discussions about other people's problems. What we're really looking for, she explained with the authority of someone who'd never had her judgment tested beyond choosing between caramel and vanilla lattes, is someone who can fit into our culture. Someone who understands that modern business is about collaboration, not dominance. Dominance. She said it like I'd walked into their office in full battle gear instead of a borrowed blazer and sensible heels. The silence that followed was thick with assumptions. I couldn't challenge without revealing things that would violate security clearances these people couldn't begin to comprehend. While they'd been building their careers in air-conditioned comfort, I'd been building something they'd never understand, the kind of experience that comes from walking into darkness so others can live in the light. Look, Derek said, glancing at his Rolex with the kind of theatrical impatience that meant this interview was over before it had really begun. We appreciate your service. We really do. But Meridian Capital isn't a charity case for veterans who can't adapt to civilian life. Charity case, veterans who can't adapt. The words hit me like a physical blow, precise and calculated to find every insecurity I'd carried since leaving active duty. Around me, I could see nods of agreement from people who'd convinced themselves that their judgment was not only accurate but compassionate. They saw my military service and assumed I was damaged goods too rigid for innovation, too aggressive for collaboration, too broken for their pristine corporate culture. They'd constructed an entire narrative about who I was based on stereotypes they'd absorbed from movies and news reports, never bothering to consider that their assumptions might be catastrophically wrong. But there was no way to explain that without violating operational security protocols that had been drilled into me during years of classified assignments. No way to tell them that their charity case held clearances that would make most federal employees jealous, that she'd prevented terrorist attacks they'd never know had been planned. So I sat there, absorbing their casual cruelty like incoming fire, while Derek shuffled through papers that would determine whether I could afford groceries next month. We'll be in touch, he said with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. But honestly, you might want to consider government work, something that better matches your background. Government work, like it was a consolation prize for people who couldn't hack it in the real world. As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave their glass tower with its marble floors and million-dollar views, I carried secrets that would shatter their comfortable assumptions about who belonged in their corporate ecosystem. But they'd never know that. They'd never know anything about the woman they'd just dismissed as a charity case. At least, not until the truth came calling in a way none of us expected. Derek was still shuffling through papers, muttering something about getting back to me within the week, when the first explosion shook the 32nd floor of the Meridian Capitol building. The sound hit like a physical force, a deep, bone-rattling boom that made the floor-to-ceiling windows vibrate in their frames and sent coffee cups sliding across the polished conference table. The ambient hum of air conditioning and elevator machinery suddenly seemed deafeningly loud in the stunned silence that followed. Then the screaming started. Not the polite, controlled sounds of corporate life, but raw human terror echoing through marble corridors and glass-walled offices. Voices shouting instructions, feet running, the sharp electronic wail of fire alarms cutting through everything like a blade. Derek's face went white as printer paper. What the hell? The conference room door exploded inward. A man in dark tactical clothing burst through, assault rifle raised, his movements precise and purposeful. Black mask covered everything except his eyes, cold, focused, the kind of gaze that comes from someone who's already made peace with violence. He swept the room like a professional, weapon tracking from target to target. Everyone on the ground, now. The 3 other interview candidates dropped instantly, scrambling under chairs and behind the conference table, with the panicked desperation of people who'd never been closer to violence than an action movie. Madison screamed and dove beneath Derek's desk, her iPad clattering across marble. Derek himself was frozen behind his chair, cell phone trembling in his hand as he tried to dial 911 with fingers that wouldn't cooperate. His mouth moved soundlessly, forming words his throat couldn't produce. But I didn't move. Training kicked in like muscle memory, every sense sharpening, time seeming to slow as tactical awareness flooded my system. I could smell the cordite residue on his clothes, see the slight tremor in his dominant hand that meant adrenaline, not experience. Could read his posture, his positioning, the way he held the weapon. Amateur. Angry, committed, dangerous but amateur. "Get down!" he screamed at me, swinging the rifle in my direction. I said, "Get down." Instead, I rose slowly from my chair, hands visible but not raised, moving with the kind of calm deliberation that comes from 15 years of training for moments exactly like this. "Easy," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of someone who'd talked armed hostiles down from situations far worse than this. "Easy. What do you need?" Derek's whispered panic cut through the air. "What are you doing? Stay down, he's got a gun." I didn't take my eyes off the gunman. "He doesn't want hostages," I said quietly, still watching his stance, his grip, the way his finger rested on the trigger. "He wants a statement." The masked man's eyes narrowed above the black fabric. "Shut up. Everyone shut up." But I was already moving. 15 years of tactical training compressed into 3 seconds of fluid motion. Step left to break his sightline, duck under his muzzle sweep, drive my shoulder into his weapon arm while my right hand found the Glock 19 concealed beneath my blazer. The rifle clattered across marble as he stumbled backward, off balance and suddenly weaponless. My sidearm was in my hands before he hit the ground, trained center mass with the kind of precision that comes from thousands of hours on the range. "Federal agent!" My voice filled the conference room with absolute authority. "Weapon down, hands where I can see them." He reached for something in his vest, backup weapon, detonator. I couldn't tell and couldn't wait to find out. The shot echoed off glass and marble, like thunder in a canyon, precise and controlled. Right shoulder, exactly where I'd aimed, designed to disable without killing. He dropped screaming, his secondary weapons spinning away across the floor. Silence. Then sirens, the cavalry arriving exactly when they always did, after the shooting stopped and the real work was done. Heavy boots thundered up stairwells and through corridors as tactical teams flooded the building. The conference room door burst open again, this time revealing NYPD SWAT officers in full gear, weapons raised and ready. But when they saw me standing over the wounded gunman with my service weapon properly holstered and my hands visible, their posture changed immediately. "Agent Martinez?" The team leader's voice carried recognition and something close to respect. "Ma'am, are you injured?" "Negative," I replied, falling back into the formal language of operations. "Suspect is down and secured. Single gunshot wound to right shoulder, non-fatal. Room is clear." The SWAT leader lowered his weapon and actually saluted. "Outstanding work, Agent. EMTs are en route." Behind me, I could hear Derek's voice, shaky and confused. "Agent? Did he just call her agent?" One of the SWAT officers was already calling it in on his radio. "Control, this is Bravo team. FBI agent on scene has neutralized the threat. Repeat. One of ours took down the shooter. Building is secure. FBI agent." The words seemed to echo through that conference room like gospel truth, cutting through 5 years of assumptions about who belonged in corporate America and who didn't. I turned to face Derek, who was still crouched behind his chair, cell phone forgotten in his hand, as he stared at me like I was someone he'd never seen before. Madison had emerged from under his desk, her perfect makeup streaked with tears, looking at the woman she'd dismissed as a charity case 20 minutes earlier. Your FBI?" Derek's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Special Agent Julia Martinez," I said simply. "Counter-terrorism division. 8 years military, 5 years federal service." The silence that followed was different from the stunned quiet after gunfire. This was the silence of people realizing they'd been catastrophically wrong about someone, of assumptions shattering under the weight of reality they couldn't ignore. While they'd been building careers in air-conditioned comfort, their charity case had been building something they'd never understand, the kind of experience that comes from standing between predators and innocent people when everything goes to hell. But as EMTs rushed past me to treat the wounded gunman, as federal agents began processing the scene, as Derek and his colleagues struggled to comprehend what they'd just witnessed, I realized something that changed everything. I didn't need their validation anymore. I'd never needed it. The work spoke for itself. The silence that followed the SWAT team's arrival was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in a corporate environment. Not the polite quiet after Derek's condescending speeches, or the respectful hush during PowerPoint presentations. This was the thunderous silence of people processing something that had shattered every assumption they'd held about the woman sitting in the corner chair 20 minutes earlier. Derek rose slowly from behind his chair, his Armani suit wrinkled, his carefully styled hair disheveled, staring at me like I was someone who'd materialized from an alternate dimension. You're really FBI?" His voice cracked on the words, the same voice that had dismissed my military service as irrelevant to modern business. "Special Agent Julia Martinez," I said, my tone carrying the authority that comes from 15 years of federal service. Counterterrorism Division. 10 years active duty, 5 years bureau. The resume says it all if you knew how to read it. The words hit that conference room like controlled detonations, each syllable destroying another piece of the narrative they'd constructed about who belonged in their corporate ecosystem. Madison emerged fully from beneath the desk, her iPad clutched against her chest like armor. Mascara streaked down her cheeks as she stared at the woman she'd giggled about 30 minutes earlier. The 3 other interview candidates were still crouched behind furniture, looking at me with expressions that ranged from awe to something approaching fear. "But you said you were looking for work?" Derek stammered, his recruiter confidence completely evaporated. "You interviewed for a financial analyst position." "I am looking for work," I replied, holstering my service weapon with the kind of casual precision that made everyone flinch. Federal budget cuts mean early retirement for a lot of us. Thought I'd try the private sector. The irony was so thick you could taste it. While Derek had been explaining why my military experience was irrelevant to modern business, his irrelevant candidate had just saved every life in that building. Behind me, I could hear the approaching thunder of news crews, helicopters circling outside, reporters flooding the lobby 32 floors below. The kind of media attention that turns ordinary Tuesday mornings into stories people remember for decades. Agent Sullivan from the FBI's New York field office appeared in the doorway, his expression carrying the weight of someone who'd just learned that one of his best agents had gone dark on a simple job interview. "Martinez," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Hell of a thing. You hurt?" "Negative, sir. Clean takedown. Minimal collateral." "Outstanding." He turned to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed one of the Bureau's finest at work. Agent Martinez has prevented more terrorist attacks than most people know exist." Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Around him, corporate executives who'd spent the morning measuring worth in stock options and quarterly earnings were trying to process the reality that their charity case operated in a world where success was measured in lives saved and disasters prevented. "Miss Martinez," Derek finally managed, his voice small and uncertain, "about the position we discussed. I think there might have been some misunderstanding. We'd be honored to have someone of your caliber join our team." I looked at this man who'd spent 45 minutes explaining why my experience was inadequate for his world, who'd laughed about my military service while sitting behind a desk I'd just defended with my life. "Derek," I said, my voice carrying the kind of finality that comes from making decisions under fire, "I didn't come here to be tolerated. I came here because I thought I wanted normal. I thought I wanted silence, air conditioning, meetings about meetings." I gestured toward the wounded gunman being loaded onto a stretcher by EMTs, toward the tactical teams still securing the building, toward the very real evidence of what happened when normal got interrupted by reality. "But some of us were born to run toward the noise," I continued. "Some of us were made for the moments when everything goes to hell and someone has to stand between the innocent and the monsters." The transformation in that room was immediate and complete. One by one, people began to rise not in corporate courtesy, but in genuine recognition of something they'd never imagined they'd witness. The applause started with Agent Sullivan, crisp and military. Then the SWAT team leader joined in. Then, slowly, The corporate executives who dismissed me as unemployable began clapping for the woman who'd just saved their lives. Madison was crying openly now, not from fear, but from something deeper. The recognition that she'd spent the morning mocking someone who would have died to protect her. One of the other interview candidates whispered to his neighbor, "She saved us all." The standing ovation built like thunder rolling across mountains, swelling until it filled the conference room and spilled out into the corridors where other employees had gathered. News crews pressed against the windows, cameras rolling, capturing the moment when assumptions shattered and truth emerged, wearing a shoulder holster and speaking with federal authority. But as I stood there, surrounded by applause that had come 15 years too late, I realized something that changed everything. I didn't need their validation. I'd never needed it. The work spoke for itself. The lives saved spoke for themselves. The man in custody spoke louder than any performance review ever could. I turned toward the door, leaving Derek and his corporate colleagues to process what they'd witnessed, what they'd dismissed, what they'd almost missed entirely. "Agent Martinez," Derek called after me, desperation creeping into his voice. "The offer stands. Whatever salary you want, whatever title you need." I paused at the threshold, looking back at the conference room where I'd been judged inadequate for civilian life by people who'd never been tested beyond quarterly earnings calls. "Derek," I said quietly, "some jobs you apply for, others choose you." As I walked away from Meridian Capital, leaving behind their glass towers and marble floors and carefully controlled environment, I understood something fundamental about worth and purpose, and the difference between career and calling. The noise was calling, and I was ready to answer. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Julia's story reminds us that worth isn't determined by corporate approval, that heroism often comes disguised as ordinary experience, and that the most qualified people are sometimes the ones others are quickest to dismiss. We've all been in that interview room, maybe not facing armed terrorists, but facing people who couldn't see our value, who judged our worth by their limited understanding of what matters. Maybe you're a veteran struggling to translate military experience into corporate language. Maybe you're a first responder tired of being told your skills don't transfer. Maybe you're anyone who's been underestimated by people who've never been tested the way you have. Here's what you can do. Share your hidden strength story. Drop a comment about a time when people underestimated your background, your skills, or your experience. Whether it's military service, first responder work, caregiving, or any other experience that prepared you for challenges others can't imagine. Your story might help someone else recognize their own worth. Support transitioning veterans and first responders. If you're in hiring, look beyond the buzzwords to see the real skills these candidates bring. If you know someone transitioning from service to civilian work, remind them that their experience has value, even when others can't see it. Stop apologizing for your strength. If you've been trained for high-stakes situations, if you've served something bigger than yourself, if you've walked into danger so others could stay safe, that's not something to downplay in interviews or conversations. Own your experience. Let people rise to meet your level instead of shrinking to meet theirs. Follow for more stories of hidden heroes. End quote. 2ek. Subscribe if you want to hear more about people whose real qualifications can't be captured on a resume, whose most important work happens when no one's watching, whose worth is measured in lives changed rather than profit margins. The real question is, how many Julia Martinezes are sitting in interview rooms right now, being told they're not qualified for jobs they're overqualified for? Share this story. Someone needs to know their service matters, their experience counts, and their worth isn't determined by people who've never faced the challenges they've overcome.